Is Russia pushing even further into the Kharkiv region, even while Zelensky is trying to distance himself from NATO's aid? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's July 23rd, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first let's take a look at the control map, and the biggest change is happening right here. Now you can see, again, this is not a region of particular significance. You can see a lot of these towns on the map are very, very small. In the U.S. we call them one stoplight towns. But what you can see is Russia over the last maybe 3 days. Here's the 18th, and you can see they are pushing through in a singular direction. And this is really tough terrain for Russian forces, right? You can see it's both mountainous. It has a lot of these wooded areas. And it's worth noting that on a lot of mountains and hillsides, generally you see sort of trees, the tree line grow in the low ground, and then the high ground tends to be devoid of trees, right? It's called a tree line. So this is probably looks like some relatively tough areas for Russian forces to break. And the fact that they're doing so probably indicates that there's a lot of combat power being thrown at this direction. Again, I think the intent here is, I think Russia hopes to drive Ukraine all the way possibly to the Oskil. But I think a larger, more likely scenario is that they really just want to divert Ukrainian combat power and lock them into this fighting here. Because you can see it's hilly, it's mountainous, it's very hard for troops to get in and out. You zoom in and we see that the roads here are very narrow and there's very few of them. Which means that, again, for Ukrainian troops trying to reinforce this area, it's a tall order. So I think that's highly possible that this is part of a Russian diversionary tactic. But nonetheless, it's an effective offensive action. And that's really the only change to control that we've seen. Everything else on the map is fairly minor. You could see here a small, low value kind of no man's land being reassessed as Russian controlled near Priyutine. Just a lot of that sort of nickel and dime changes or updates to the exact locations on the maps. But that's the big news, right? When we look at the combat map, you can see Russian forces, right, are slowly building back an offensive tempo. All right, launching attacks across the east, Donetsk, counterattacking in Bakhmut, Bilohorivka, as well as, of course, this region here near some of these towns in these mountainous regions. Near Setove. So again, we're not seeing this isn't extremely high stakes. Again, you can see how far it is from any sort of developed town or region, but mostly it is the fact that Ukraine can't ignore this, right? They can't allow Russian forces to break through. And this may be part of, a controlled withdrawal, as we saw in Bakhmut, is a reasonable tactic, right, to attrit enemy forces and prevent a breakthrough, or to even draw enemy forces into a battle where they can't win. All of which is a valid way of doing this sort of tactics. And in some ways, it could actually, I would even argue, as we talked about with Bakhmut, the places where the enemy is on offense, by definition, are the places where the enemy is not on defense. And so a large-scale counterattack can sometimes, if the enemy is really stretched thin, can sometimes actually be a highly effective tactic, right, to sort of counterpunch Russian forces. Let's actually, I'm going to pull up real quick the fortification map, and we'll just do a quick size up, kind of in real time, what Russian fortifications look like in this region. So you can see here that right now, as far as Russian fortifications go, obviously this mountainous terrain here is sort of its own fortification. It's really hard to assault up a mountain. And then you can see there's flatlands here, and then a second defensive line that's established on these low grounds here. This is kind of a strange place to build an elaborate trench line, but it probably offers fire protection or cover or field of fire of this whole region up to these mountains. So, I would say that it's a maybe in terms of if it's an effective place to try to launch an attack. Certainly, it's not. It's much lighter. It has much lighter defenses than, again, you can see this Wagner line near Bakhmut, which has multi-layered trenches, and certainly lighter in many cases than areas. Some of these key areas are in and around Zaporizhzhia. I mean, you can see the level of fortification and trench networks near Robotyne, where we've seen a lot of Ukrainian offensive action, as well as somewhat thinner, but still very robust outside Staromayorsk and along this roadway here. So, again, just some food for thought, I'd say. Something to think about how Ukraine can take advantage of Russia's desire to continually go on offense. Now, what I did want to talk a little bit about, first off, is that if you're members of combatvetnews.com, you saw we checked out the viral video of the Chechen forces conducting an ambush. And what I talked about this on the live stream, what made this video so cool to watch is that it actually was it was not done as a Western ambush. It was done as an insurgent ambush. You may know a lot of Chechen fighters fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. They also, of course, have experience in their guerrilla war in Chechnya, their home region. And so they've evolved a very different way of conducting ambushes. And to see it from a GoPro perspective, especially as someone who's been on the opposite side of some of these ambushes, was fascinating. And it's a fascinating look at a totally different way of tactical thinking. So if you want to get access to this sort of in-depth combat footage analysis, it's totally uncensored. I always find the uncensored videos. You can become a member of combatvetnews.com. Any one of these tiers will get you access, as well as to the members only room on the Discord. And it's the number one way to support the channel. And I depend on your guys' support. It's hard to get sponsors. YouTube doesn't really like to keep these videos monetized. So I depend on you guys, and I appreciate each and every one of you. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about is some of the statements from Zelensky recently. And it's sort of not exactly leaving you with feeling great because, like Zelensky's a good guy, but he's also a politician. And you can see him starting to distance himself from some of the results of the counteroffensive so far. He said that the counteroffensive operations may soon increase in tempo and that the delay in counteroffensive operations was due in part to limited material. At the Aspen Security Forum 2 days ago, he said that Ukrainian forces had plans to launch counteroffensive operations in the spring, but the lack of munitions and military equipment, such as mine-clearing equipment, and continued Ukrainian training abroad necessitated a delay. He said the delay allowed Russian forces to establish more minefields and multiple defensive lines. I think that's probably true. I don't think that's probably true. I think that is definitely true. The likely, it's hard because, as we talked about at the time, you don't get to launch offensive operations with the army that you have to make a trade-off between your ability to prepare and the enemy's ability to prepare. And I think ultimately the calculus was off because while Russian forces, right, while Ukraine was gaining brigade-sized additions to its fighting forces, thanks to its NATO partners, Russia was also digging in and entrenching its positions. And I think there was a miscalculation that there was a belief that, 1 week of defensive preparation was not as good as 1 week of offensive preparation, right? But in fact, while the defensive preparations that Russia did were very effective, even though they were much cheaper, right? Deploying mines is much easier than training an entire brigade. Digging a trench is not as technically sophisticated as learning to conduct combined arms operations. And so you have these differences. And in fact, the delays seem to have favored the defenders, right? The defenders were able to spend that time to make their positions much more robust than the offensive side was able to grow their offensive capabilities. And so, again, this is like an oblique reference. Also reference the fact that you see minefields being a constant in almost every statement. Mark Miley made reference to the struggles of clearing minefields. You see Zelensky talking about minefields and military equipment like mine clearing equipment. I think no one wants to say it, but the failure of NATO to find a real workable solution to address mines at scale, at an industrial scale, is the failure, one of the biggest NATO failures of several decades, right? I think NATO had this belief that because a lot of countries all shook hands and said that we weren't going to deploy mines, that therefore it didn't have to prepare to fight in a mined environment. And despite the fact that mines were the most effective tactic in Iraq and Afghanistan, still no one really thought that a state actor who could deploy mines, not like the Taliban who would deploy IEDs or mines, by the tens a day, someone like Russia can deploy mines by the thousands per day. And solving that problem, right, it is a very different equation. It's sort of like saying how if you go hunting, right, getting one deer is not that hard, right? There's a process for taking out one deer. If you say, hey, we actually have a deer population problem and we need to eliminate thousands of deer or tens of thousands of deer, all of a sudden you need to have new innovative tactics, new innovative strategies to solve that problem, right? And NATO focused entirely on how to become better at hunting one deer, instead of asking the real question, which is how do we defeat mines at scale, at the tens of thousands. All right, Zelensky said the counteroffensive. Again, I think you have Zelensky on one hand distancing himself from the current failures that they were ready in the spring, but they didn't want to because they were getting more gear, and simultaneously saying that counteroffensive operations may soon increase in tempo due to ongoing mine clearing operations. I think this is another good sign, right? It's not clear on how exactly you can clear mines in an active combat zone. It's tough to figure out, right? Because if Russian forces are allowed to redeploy to an area where the mines have been cleared, then they're going to redeploy mines. So it's really tough to discern this sort of thing. How do you clear mines in a region where you don't have combat control? And it's a good question, right? And if you slowly clear a minefield, but you give the enemy, again, they only need days, hours to deploy a new minefield behind your lines, right? So like if they advance, clear a minefield and advance and take a town in Zaporizhzhia, because it takes a week to do that, Russian forces are going to be deploying mines on the other side of that town so that when Ukrainian forces attempt to advance, they'll have to clear yet another minefield. And so this is sort of, I think, the problem that they're facing. And again, maybe there's some sort of strategy that Ukraine has where they can force out Russian forces from a region, and then conduct some sort of mine clearing and then move troops into the area and prevent Russia from redeploying mines. It's really unclear on how exactly this is going to work. But I think it's an indicator that things may get better, but things may also, there's an acknowledgement that their mistakes were made, especially vis-a-vis mines and mining. They also, Ukrainian officials are being more explicit that they're launching the interdiction campaign against Russian logistics and military targets in the rear areas, degrading their logistics, counter-battery capabilities, and hopefully degrading Russian forces faster than Ukrainian forces are degrading. Right. And there's an acknowledgement that Ukrainian missile and artillery units are responsible, according to Ukraine, for 90% of Russian losses. And Ukrainian missile and artillery units have created a long-range fire fist thanks to Western high-precision systems that are so accurate Russian forces can't really conduct effective counter-battery fire. So I think this is, again, an indicator of a pivoting strategy where there is, again, a focus on more about logistics and constant pressure on Russian forces in lieu of deliberate charge-first, tank-based offensive operations. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. As always, thank you to our Colonel tier members of CombatVetNews.com. I really couldn't do this without you guys. I couldn't do this without our Lieutenant tier members. Really, it means the world that you guys are out here supporting us. Thank you so much, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.